Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the medieval world through a very particular doorway. Not through its battles or its kings or its castles, but through its leftovers. The things that were created for one urgent moment, one narrow purpose, one uncertain century, and then simply refused to disappear. Some were built to solve short-term problems. Some were made for fear, for order, for devotion, or for survival. And yet many of them outlived the people who invented them, outlived the kingdoms that defended them, and in some cases still shape daily life now, hundreds of years later. Before we begin, if you enjoy calm, carefully researched history told with patience and depth, consider subscribing. A surprising number of regular listeners watch without it, and subscribing is a simple way to make sure these long-form historical deep dives keep finding you. When people imagine the Middle Ages, they often imagine a closed world, distant and self-contained, sealed behind monastery walls and castle gates. But medieval life was never really temporary in the way we like to think. It was experimental, improvised, and often unstable, yet many of its solutions became habits, and many of its habits became institutions. Again and again, medieval Europeans created something to answer an immediate pressure, only to discover that once a system enters daily life, it is very difficult to remove. A tax introduced during crisis becomes normal administration. A legal custom adopted for convenience becomes tradition. A temporary market privilege becomes the foundation of urban wealth. A defensive measure becomes a border. A religious calendar becomes the rhythm of society. The medieval period was full of arrangements that seemed provisional at first, but permanence has a way of hiding inside emergency. One of the clearest examples is the university. In its earliest form, the medieval university did not emerge because someone sat down and designed a timeless institution for higher learning. It grew more awkwardly than that, out of cathedral schools, urban growth, legal privileges, and the practical need to train clergy, lawyers, and administrators. Places like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford became centers of study in part because they gathered masters and students together under protections that were originally quite specific. These communities needed exemptions, charters, rights of self-governance, and recognition from church or crown because large numbers of scholars could easily become vulnerable in a medieval town. Students were often poor, transient, and foreign. Teachers needed authority that local officials would respect. So the university, at first, was less a campus in the modern sense than a protected corporation, almost a legal body, created to manage a difficult but useful population. And yet this arrangement, which might have seemed like a practical medieval compromise, proved astonishingly durable. The idea that knowledge should be organized into faculties, that advanced learning should be certified by degrees, that students should pass through recognized stages of instruction, and that a scholarly community should possess certain rights distinct from the ordinary population, all of this survived the medieval world that produced it. The robes changed meaning. The language of instruction shifted. Theology lost its central monopoly. But the underlying structure remained recognizable. Even now, when a modern student enrolls in a university, enters a faculty, earns a degree, and joins an institution with its own internal governance and traditions, they are moving through an inheritance shaped in the Middle Ages. What began as a practical framework for managing teachers and learners in unstable urban settings became one of the most enduring educational systems in human history. Another medieval creation that proved far less temporary than intended was the standing pattern of tolls, charters, and municipal privilege that built many European towns. Medieval rulers frequently granted market rights or fair rights to settlements for very immediate reasons. They needed revenue. They wanted to encourage population growth in a contested region. They hoped to reward loyalty, stimulate trade, or strengthen a fragile frontier. In many cases, these grants were not philosophical declarations about urban liberty. They were tools. A king, lord, bishop, or prince might permit a weekly market, an annual fair, or exemption from certain dues because it solved a present political need. The expectation may well have been that the privilege would serve the ruler as much as the town. But once merchants gathered regularly in one place, once roads began bending toward that market, once artisans settled nearby, once warehouses, churches, courts, and guilds clustered around that protected exchange, temporary advantage hardened into urban identity. A charter granted under one dynasty could shape prosperity for centuries. Market towns became permanent towns. Permanent towns became cities. Entire commercial landscapes grew from medieval permissions that may originally have looked narrow and conditional. In England, France, the Low Countries, the German lands, and beyond, the medieval market was not merely a place of trade. It was a machine for creating continuity. It tied peasant surplus to regional exchange, tied craft production to local regulation, and tied local wealth to political bargaining. Even the modern instinct to think of certain places as natural centers of trade often conceals the fact that many were built on medieval privileges that once answered highly specific needs. The same pattern appears in law. Medieval rulers repeatedly introduced legal practices as solutions to disorder, fragmentation, or administrative weakness, and many of those practices stayed. Consider the development of common law in England. It did not descend fully formed as an eternal legal philosophy. It emerged through royal attempts to extend authority, standardize judgment, and make the king's justice more reliable than the patchwork of local customs alone. Royal courts, writs, itinerant judges, and increasingly recorded decisions grew partly from a practical problem: how to govern a kingdom where local power was uneven and where law could vary sharply from place to place. The crown needed procedures that traveled better than memory and reached further than local custom. What followed was not a quick reform with a clean endpoint, but a cumulative habit of governance. The procedures introduced to solve medieval administrative problems gradually became the framework of an entire legal tradition. Over generations, precedent acquired weight. Court forms acquired authority. Legal language grew more technical and more conservative. What may once have appeared to be a set of royal mechanisms for improving control became one of the defining features of legal life across not only England but eventually much of the English-speaking world. Here again, the medieval period produced something that was not intended as a monument to eternity, but as a working answer to the problem of ruling effectively. It lasted because workable systems are rarely dismantled when power has learned how to use them. Then there is the parish, one of the quietest but most powerful medieval inheritances. The parish was, in theory, a spiritual geography. It organized pastoral care, sacraments, burial, and the routine obligations of Christian life. But in practice it became much more than that. It marked community boundaries, structured charity, tracked obligation, and helped define belonging itself. Medieval people were baptized somewhere, married somewhere, buried somewhere, and expected to support the local church in some fashion. The parish was not simply where worship happened. It was one of the basic ways society knew how to place a person within a moral and local order. Its durability came from repetition. A border visited once is easy to forget. A border crossed every week becomes part of the mind. Over time, the parish shaped memory, administration, and local identity so deeply that even later religious upheaval and state expansion did not fully erase its influence. In many places, civil administration ended up borrowing or reflecting ecclesiastical geography. Records of births, marriages, and deaths remained entangled with parish structures long after medieval assumptions had begun to weaken. What began as a framework for spiritual care became a skeleton for social organization. It is one of the great medieval examples of permanence created not by grand design, but by quiet routine. Medieval taxation offers another revealing case. Extraordinary taxes were often introduced under the language of necessity. A war had to be funded. A ransom had to be paid. A military threat had to be met. A ruler might present a levy as exceptional, temporary, and tied to a specific emergency. And sometimes, at first, it truly was. Medieval government was usually not strong enough to tax the population with the smooth regularity of modern states. Extraordinary taxation, therefore, carried a special political meaning. It had to be justified. It had to be negotiated. It had to be presented as a response to danger. Yet the repetition of emergency created familiarity. Once rulers learned methods of assessment, once communities learned how collection worked, once officials, records, and expectations were in place, future taxation became easier to imagine and easier to defend. The exceptional slowly trained society for the regular. The medieval state was not a modern fiscal machine, but it laid important groundwork for one by discovering that temporary burdens could become precedents. This is one of the most important themes in all institutional history. People resist novelty, but they often tolerate repetition. A tax collected once is controversial. Even medieval clothing contains examples of the temporary becoming permanent. Certain garments and accessories emerged from practical need, rank, climate, or courtly distinction, then survived in forms their creators could never have predicted. Buttons, for example, became increasingly significant in medieval European dress, not because people set out to create a timeless standard of fashion, but because changing cuts of clothing made new fastening methods useful and decorative. Once tailoring became more fitted, the button ceased to be trivial. It became part of how garments were made, displayed, and understood. What served medieval dress culture so well endured well beyond the age that refined it. The same can be said of academic gowns, judicial robes, and ceremonial clothing descended from older habits of status and learned authority. Medieval visual language proved sticky. Institutions like visible continuity and clothing is continuity made wearable. And perhaps most quietly of all, the medieval clock remade time. Before the later Middle Ages, time in most of Europe was not experienced in the precise, mechanical way we tend to assume today. Time was understood through natural cycles. Sunrise, sunset, the position of the sun, the ringing of church bells, and the sequence of religious observances that structured the day. Monasteries divided their routine into canonical hours, moments of prayer spaced across daylight and darkness. But these hours were not identical blocks of time as we measure them now. In winter, they stretched differently than in summer. The day itself breathed with the seasons. The arrival of the mechanical clock in medieval Europe during the late 13th and 14th centuries did not begin as a philosophical revolution in timekeeping. It emerged out of practical needs. Monasteries needed reliable signals for prayer. Town authorities wanted public clocks to regulate markets, curfews, and labor rhythms. Civic pride also played a role. A large clock tower was a visible statement that a town possessed wealth, skill, and organization. The early mechanical clocks were remarkable pieces of engineering but were not particularly accurate by modern standards. Their gears and escapements drifted. Their bells could be imprecise. Yet their cultural impact did not depend on perfect accuracy. What mattered was repetition. When a bell struck regularly across a town square, the day began to feel divided into stable units. Merchants could expect a market hour. Workers could expect the end of a shift. Councils could schedule meetings. Time was becoming public and shared rather than loosely personal. No one in the 14th century believed they were inventing the permanent architecture of modern time discipline. The clock was simply a useful civic device. But as towns grew accustomed to its rhythm, mechanical time became embedded in economic and social life. Over centuries, improvements in engineering made clocks smaller, more accurate, and more widespread. Eventually, timekeeping moved from towers to homes, from homes to pockets, and finally into the nearly invisible digital systems that structure modern society. Yet the underlying transformation began in medieval streets, under the shadow of bell towers. The idea that time could be standardized, counted, and publicly enforced began as a practical medieval convenience. Today, nearly every structured activity, work schedules, school hours, transportation timetables, rests on habits that mechanical clocks helped create. Something built to regulate monastery bells and urban markets ended up disciplining the tempo of modern civilization. Another medieval invention that proved surprisingly permanent was the guild system. Guilds were associations of craftsmen or merchants organized to regulate a particular trade. At first glance, they may appear as static institutions, but in their early development they were often pragmatic solutions to unstable urban economies. Towns were growing. Skilled trades were multiplying. Competition could easily become chaotic, and poor quality work could damage a town's reputation for decades. Guilds therefore served several purposes at once. They controlled training through apprenticeship systems. They enforced quality standards. They limited unfair competition among members. They also provided mutual support, religious participation, and sometimes charitable relief for members who became ill or impoverished. From the perspective of medieval authorities, guilds offered a convenient way to stabilize economic life without the need for constant supervision from the state. What may have seemed like a manageable arrangement for organizing craft production soon became deeply woven into urban life. Guild halls became political centers. Master craftsmen gained influence in city councils. Apprenticeship became a widely accepted path into skilled work. Entire neighborhoods could be identified by the trades practiced there. Bakers in one street, metalworkers in another, cloth merchants clustered near the market. Even when guilds later declined or were dismantled in many places during the early modern and industrial periods, the fundamental ideas they popularized endured. Structured training, professional standards, certification of skill, and organized trade associations all echo guild practices. Modern professional licensing systems, unions, and industry bodies can trace conceptual ancestry to medieval guild culture. The institution itself was not designed as a timeless model for organizing work. It was simply the most workable solution medieval towns could devise. But workable systems, once embedded in daily economic life, rarely vanish completely. Medieval borders offer another powerful example of the temporary becoming permanent. In the early Middle Ages, political boundaries were often fluid. Power shifted with dynastic marriages, military campaigns, feudal loyalties, and regional alliances. Maps were not precise in the modern sense. A frontier might consist of forests, rivers, mountain passes, or loosely defined zones of influence rather than sharply drawn lines. Yet, over time, certain defensive arrangements, fortifications, and administrative limits hardened into recognized borders. A castle built to secure a frontier might define control of a valley for generations. A march or border territory administered by a military governor could evolve into a stable region. Agreements between rival rulers might freeze lines that later generations treated as natural divisions. Many modern European boundaries still reflect these medieval arrangements. The border between England and Scotland, for example, stabilized through centuries of warfare, negotiation, and fortified landscapes during the medieval period. Similar patterns occurred throughout the continent. What began as defensive necessity eventually became geography in the political imagination. When later states consolidated power and began drawing more precise maps, they frequently inherited borders that had already been shaped by medieval conflict and compromise. Even the concept of the weekend, indirectly, has medieval roots through the influence of the Christian calendar. Medieval society was deeply structured by religious observance. Sundays were days of worship and rest, while numerous feast days punctuated the year. Agricultural labor might still occur when necessary, but the expectation that certain days were set apart for religious reflection created a rhythm distinct from pure economic productivity. Over centuries, as European societies secularized and industrialized, these rhythms did not vanish entirely. Instead, they transformed. The modern weekend is not identical to the medieval Sunday or feast day cycle, but the idea that time should include structured intervals of rest owes much to religious patterns deeply embedded during the Middle Ages. Cultural habits formed through centuries of repetition proved remarkably resilient even as belief systems changed. One of the most fascinating aspects of these medieval inheritances is that they rarely arrived through grand declaration. No medieval council gathered to announce that universities, professional training systems, standardized time, urban charters, and enduring borders would shape the next 1,000 years. Each of these systems emerged gradually through trial, negotiation, necessity, and adaptation. The Middle Ages were a period of experimentation under pressure. Europe was fragmented politically, economically uneven, and frequently unstable. Solutions needed to be practical rather than perfect. Yet that very pragmatism often produced systems flexible enough to survive beyond the crises that created them. In historical hindsight, permanence often appears planned. We imagine that enduring institutions must have been designed with great foresight. But the medieval experience suggests something different. Many lasting structures of society are not born from perfect design but from repeated usefulness. A solution that works reasonably well tends to be used again. Over time, repetition becomes expectation. Expectation becomes tradition. Tradition becomes something that later generations hesitate to dismantle. And sometimes what was meant to be temporary simply becomes too familiar to remove. The medieval world was filled with such examples. Arrangements built for urgency that gradually became foundations. When we walk through a modern university campus, glance at a clock tower, attend a professional training program, cross a national border, or follow the weekly rhythm of work and rest, we are often interacting with echoes of medieval solutions to medieval problems. In the next part, we'll explore several more medieval ideas and institutions that were never meant to last forever, yet somehow still surround us today. Continuing from that thought, another medieval creation that proved far less temporary than anyone likely expected was the system of surnames. For most of early medieval Europe, people did not possess fixed family names in the modern sense. A single personal name was often enough within a small village where everyone knew one another. If further identification was needed, it might be added casually, John the Miller, William son of Robert, Alice from the Hill, or Thomas the Baker. These were descriptive additions, useful in conversation but not necessarily permanent across generations. Yet as medieval societies grew more complex, populations increased, towns expanded, and administrative records became more important, this loose naming system began to strain. Kings collected taxes. Courts recorded disputes. Church officials kept baptism and marriage registers. Merchants signed contracts. A single given name was no longer sufficient when dozens of people might share it within the same town. The solution was practical rather than ideological. Descriptive identifiers gradually became inherited surnames. A man known as Richard Baker might pass the name Baker to his children, even if they never worked in a bakery. Someone once identified as Robert of Lincoln might pass the surname Lincoln to generations who never lived there. The process was uneven across Europe, unfolding over several centuries between roughly the 11th and 15th centuries. No medieval authority seems to have imagined that this convenient administrative habit would define personal identity for centuries to come. But once surnames became useful for legal records, property ownership, and inheritance, they became nearly impossible to abandon. Governments relied on them. Communities recognized them. Families built identities around them. What began as a temporary tool to distinguish individuals became one of the most universal features of modern identity. Even today, when people sign documents, open bank accounts, enroll in schools, or travel internationally, they are participating in a naming convention that slowly hardened during the Middle Ages. The system was never designed as a permanent global standard. It was simply the most practical solution to a growing medieval problem: keeping track of people in an increasingly complex society. Another surprisingly durable medieval development was the concept of the corporation. In modern language, the word corporation often conjures images of large businesses and multinational companies. But the underlying legal idea began in a very different environment. During the medieval period, communities needed ways to organize groups that could act as single legal bodies. Monasteries owned land. Towns negotiated with rulers. Universities governed scholars. Guilds managed trade. To make these groups function effectively, medieval law developed the concept of the corporate body, an entity recognized as having legal continuity beyond the lives of its individual members. A monastery could hold property even as monks entered and left the community. A town council could make agreements that remained valid despite changing leadership. A university could maintain privileges granted decades or centuries earlier. The concept solved a clear administrative challenge. Without it, every change in membership might require rewriting agreements, renegotiating rights, or redistributing property. Recognizing a group as a legal person created stability. At the time, this was a practical innovation aimed at governing religious houses, municipal bodies, and scholarly communities. Yet the legal concept proved extraordinarily flexible. Over time, it expanded beyond medieval institutions into commerce, finance, and eventually the modern corporate world. The legal continuity that once allowed a monastery to own farmland eventually allowed companies to own factories, patents, and international investments. Once again, the medieval world created something intended to solve immediate organizational problems. But the underlying idea that a group could exist as a continuous legal entity turned out to be powerful enough to shape the structure of modern economies. Medieval infrastructure offers another example of the temporary becoming permanent. Many roads across Europe follow routes first formalized or heavily used during the Middle Ages. While some ancient Roman roads remained in use, countless medieval paths emerged simply because they connected markets, pilgrimage sites, castles, and river crossings. Pilgrimage routes in particular had enormous influence. Thousands of travelers moving toward religious destinations such as Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury, or Rome needed paths, hostels, bridges, and waypoints. These routes were not originally engineered as long-term transportation corridors. They existed because pilgrims walked them, merchants followed them, and towns along the way discovered economic opportunities in serving travelers. As traffic increased, paths widened, bridges were reinforced, inns appeared. Local economies adapted to steady movement along these routes. In time, what began as footpaths for medieval travelers became stable lines of communication. When later generations built improved roads, railways, and highways, they often followed routes already established by centuries of medieval movement. Infrastructure, once established, tends to persist. It becomes the path of least resistance. Even modern transportation networks frequently trace lines first shaped by medieval trade, pilgrimage, and military logistics. Another medieval inheritance that still influences the modern world is the structure of parliamentary or representative assemblies. During the Middle Ages, rulers often needed consent from powerful groups in society to raise taxes or secure political support. Nobles, clergy, and sometimes representatives of towns might be summoned to councils or assemblies to discuss matters affecting the realm. These gatherings were rarely democratic in the modern sense. Participation was limited and heavily influenced by social hierarchy. Yet they created an important precedent. Rulers negotiating with organized representatives of different social groups. In England, the gradual development of Parliament during the 13th and 14th centuries emerged from precisely this dynamic. Kings sought approval for taxation and policy. Representatives of counties and towns attended sessions alongside nobles and church leaders. Over time, the process of consultation became more formalized. No medieval king envisioned that such assemblies would eventually evolve into modern parliamentary democracy. Yet the habit of consultation created institutional continuity. Procedures developed, records were kept, expectations formed. Later political movements would build upon these medieval precedents when expanding representation and limiting royal authority. Here again we see a familiar pattern. What began as a practical method for negotiating power during times of financial or political pressure became a lasting institutional framework. Even seemingly small features of daily life sometimes trace their persistence to medieval improvisation. Consider the layout of many European town centers. Narrow streets, irregular squares, and market plazas often reflect centuries-old patterns formed long before modern urban planning existed. Medieval towns grew organically around defensive walls, trade routes, water sources, and marketplaces. A baker might build near a busy corner. A church might expand its surrounding square. Merchants might cluster along the busiest road leading to the gate. Over generations, these practical decisions created complex urban landscapes that later authorities found difficult to reshape. When cities modernized in the 19th and 20th centuries, planners sometimes widened roads or created new boulevards. But many medieval street patterns survived simply because rebuilding entire towns was impractical. As a result, modern pedestrians often walk through city centers whose shapes were largely determined by medieval decisions made hundreds of years earlier. Perhaps the most important lesson from these examples is that permanence rarely announces itself when it begins. Medieval people were not consciously building the foundations of modern society. They were responding to immediate challenges, organizing learning, regulating trade, identifying individuals, managing communities, raising revenue, coordinating travel, or negotiating political authority. Each solution worked well enough to survive the next generation, and then the next. History is full of dramatic moments, revolutions, battles, discoveries, but the quieter story of institutional survival is often just as powerful. Systems that function reliably tend to remain in place even as the world around them changes. And so the Middle Ages, a period often imagined as distant and temporary, quietly left behind structures that continue shaping modern life. The universities that educate millions, the surnames that define family identity, the legal concept of corporations, the routes of roads, the rhythms of timekeeping, and the habits of representation in government all carry traces of medieval invention. These things were never meant to last forever. But sometimes history does not ask whether something was meant to last. It simply asks whether it works. And once we begin to notice this pattern, medieval solutions quietly becoming permanent features of society, it becomes difficult to stop seeing it. The Middle Ages were filled with arrangements meant to stabilize an uncertain world. Many of those arrangements were introduced cautiously, often framed as temporary responses to particular pressures. Yet once people began relying on them, their temporary nature slowly faded from memory. One particularly revealing example can be found in the medieval banking system. During the early Middle Ages, long-distance trade in Europe was limited compared to later centuries. But as towns expanded and commerce revived between the 11th and 13th centuries, merchants increasingly needed ways to move money safely across large distances. Carrying large quantities of coin across mountains, forests, and politically unstable territories was dangerous. Theft was common, and transport itself was slow and uncertain. Italian merchant cities such as Florence, Venice, and Genoa began experimenting with financial practices that would make trade safer and more efficient. Among the most important of these innovations was the bill of exchange. A merchant in one city could deposit money with a banking house and receive a written instrument promising payment in another city. The document could be carried by the traveler instead of the coin itself. At first, this system was simply a practical response to risk. It reduced the chance of robbery and simplified transactions across borders. Banking houses also developed techniques for currency conversion, credit, and accounting that helped merchants navigate the complex monetary landscape of medieval Europe. No one in the 14th century believed they were laying the foundation for the modern global financial system. They were simply solving the problem of moving money safely between markets. Yet the methods developed in medieval banking houses proved extraordinarily adaptable. Over centuries, they expanded into more sophisticated financial instruments, international credit networks, and eventually modern banking institutions. Even the language of finance still carries medieval echoes. Words like bank, derived from the benches used by money changers in Italian markets, remind us that modern financial systems trace their ancestry to crowded medieval streets, where merchants counted coins and scribes recorded obligations in ledgers. Another medieval practice that unexpectedly shaped modern life is the system of professional apprenticeship. As towns grew and specialized crafts became more important, the question of how skills should be transmitted became increasingly significant. A blacksmith, weaver, mason, or carpenter required years of practice to master their trade. Knowledge was not easily written down. It was learned through observation and repetition. The solution adopted by many guilds was apprenticeship. A young person would enter the household of a master craftsman, often in their early teens, and spend several years learning the skills, discipline, and standards of the trade. The arrangement also regulated competition. Only those who completed training could eventually become masters themselves. At the time, apprenticeship was simply the most reliable way to preserve technical knowledge. But the broader idea, structured learning under the guidance of experienced professionals, proved remarkably durable. Modern professions continue to use similar models. Medical residencies, legal clerkships, skilled trade training programs, and even certain academic mentoring structures echo the medieval apprenticeship system. The terminology has evolved, and the context has changed dramatically, but the underlying concept remains recognizable. Mastery requires guided experience, and structured pathways into skilled work benefit both learners and society. Medieval record-keeping also produced systems that quietly endured far beyond their original purpose. As governments, churches, and towns became more organized, they increasingly relied on written records to track property, taxation, legal disputes, and population events such as births, marriages, and deaths. At first, these records were created out of necessity rather than historical curiosity. A land charter needed to be preserved to avoid future disputes. A tax assessment required documentation. Parish priests recorded baptisms and marriages because they needed to maintain order within their communities. Yet the accumulation of records gradually transformed how societies understood continuity and accountability. Written documentation allowed institutions to remember decisions long after the individuals who made them had passed away. It provided evidence in courts, stability in property ownership, and continuity in administration. Modern bureaucratic systems, with their forms, registries, archives, and legal documentation, owe much to these medieval habits of record-keeping. Governments today track citizens, land ownership, and financial obligations through systems that would feel conceptually familiar to many medieval administrators, even if the technology is vastly different. Another fascinating medieval inheritance lies in the development of insurance. Maritime trade during the Middle Ages carried enormous risks. Ships could sink in storms, cargo could be stolen by pirates, or political conflicts could suddenly close important ports. Merchants investing in long voyages faced the possibility of losing everything. To reduce this risk, merchants began developing agreements that spread financial exposure among multiple investors. Early forms of marine insurance allowed traders to insure cargo against loss during a voyage. Investors would accept a calculated risk in exchange for payment if the voyage succeeded. These arrangements did not initially resemble the large insurance companies familiar today. They were smaller, more personal agreements negotiated between merchants, investors, and financial houses. Yet the principle was clear. Uncertainty could be managed collectively through shared risk. Over time, this idea expanded beyond maritime trade into other areas of economic life. Insurance eventually covered property, life, health, and many other aspects of modern society. But the roots of the concept lie in medieval attempts to protect commercial ventures from the unpredictable dangers of the sea. Even the idea of standardized weights and measures owes part of its stability to medieval efforts at regulation. As trade expanded across regions with different customs and currencies, merchants faced constant confusion over measurement systems. A pound in one town might differ from a pound in another. Measures of grain, cloth, or wine could vary widely. Authorities increasingly recognized that commerce functioned more smoothly when measurements were standardized. Towns and kingdoms introduced official measures, sometimes displayed publicly in marketplaces so merchants could verify fairness. While true global standardization would take many centuries to achieve, medieval regulation began the long process of aligning economic practices across regions. Modern measurement systems, international trade standards, and regulatory oversight all reflect the same basic idea. Markets work better when participants share common definitions. And perhaps one of the most subtle medieval legacies lies in the concept of the archive itself. Medieval monasteries, royal chanceries, and city administrations began storing documents systematically because they needed to preserve legal memory. A land grant issued decades earlier might still be relevant. A treaty might need to be referenced generations later. What began as practical document storage eventually evolved into archival culture. the deliberate preservation of records for future consultation. Today, national archives, libraries, and research institutions maintain vast collections of historical material, allowing historians to reconstruct the past in remarkable detail. Without medieval habits of preservation, much of recorded history might have vanished. The careful storage of charters, letters, account books, and legal documents created the raw material from which modern historical knowledge is built. All of these examples reveal a quiet truth about the Middle Ages. It was not merely a period of castles, kings, and crusades. It was also an era of institutional experimentation. Medieval societies were constantly adjusting to economic revival, urban growth, religious authority, and political fragmentation. Solutions emerged through negotiation, improvisation, and necessity. They were rarely designed with the future in mind. Yet when a system proved useful, when it helped organize knowledge, stabilize trade, preserve records, regulate communities, or reduce risk, people continued using it. The centuries that followed inherited these systems and adapted them to new circumstances. Some evolved dramatically, others remained surprisingly recognizable. But in each case, the medieval world left behind structures that proved far more permanent than their creators ever intended. And perhaps that is one of the most intriguing lessons of history. What feels temporary in the present can quietly become the architecture of the future. If we step back for a moment, a pattern becomes clearer. The medieval world was not consciously designing the future, yet it repeatedly produced systems that proved durable far beyond their original circumstances. The reasons for this durability were often surprisingly simple. When a structure organizes daily life effectively, people gradually stop questioning it. It becomes normal. Once something becomes normal, replacing it requires effort, agreement, and risk. Most societies prefer stability over disruption, especially when an existing system continues to function well enough. One striking medieval inheritance that still shapes modern life is the system of public holidays. During the Middle Ages, the calendar was filled with religious feast days. These days were not simply ceremonial moments in the church year. They were woven deeply into the rhythms of work, travel, and community life. Certain saints' days, major festivals like Christmas and Easter, and numerous regional observances created a schedule of pauses throughout the year. In agricultural societies, work naturally followed seasonal demands, but feast days provided structured interruptions even when work could technically continue. Markets might close, church services would gather the community, and families often used these occasions for social gatherings. For rulers and local authorities, feast days also served practical purposes. They helped synchronize communal activity and reinforced shared cultural identity. No medieval bishop or monarch expected that these religious observances would form the distant ancestor of modern national holiday calendars. Yet when societies later became more secular, the pattern of designated days off remained attractive. Instead of disappearing, many feast days evolved into civic holidays. Others were replaced with national commemorations, labor holidays, or cultural celebrations. The structure itself, the idea that the year should include recognized pauses for rest and reflection, survived the transformation. In many countries today, the calendar of public holidays still reflects layers of medieval religious timing beneath modern civic meaning. Another medieval arrangement that proved remarkably persistent is the practice of standardized academic degrees. As medieval universities matured, they developed systems to certify levels of learning. Students would study under masters, demonstrate competence through examinations or disputations, and receive formal recognition of their knowledge. The earliest degrees were not intended as universal credentials for employment in a modern economy. They primarily marked readiness to teach or participate within the scholarly community. A bachelor had achieved foundational competence. A master or doctor possessed authority to instruct others. Yet the clarity of this system made it valuable beyond the medieval classroom. Degrees provided a recognizable signal of training and intellectual achievement. As universities expanded and education spread, the degree system became an efficient method for organizing qualifications. Today, the familiar sequence of bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degrees still reflects medieval academic traditions. The subjects studied have multiplied dramatically, and the scale of education has expanded far beyond anything medieval scholars could imagine. But the structure itself remains rooted in the intellectual culture of medieval universities. Medieval law courts also contributed another lasting habit: the careful recording of testimony and procedure. In earlier periods, legal disputes often relied heavily on memory, reputation, and local custom. But as royal and ecclesiastical courts grew more formal, scribes began documenting proceedings in written form. These records allowed courts to review past decisions, compare cases, and ensure that rulings followed recognized procedures. Written documentation also strengthened the authority of judgments, since they could be referenced later if disputes resurfaced. What began as a practical administrative habit eventually became a defining feature of modern legal systems. Court transcripts, legal archives, and procedural records are now central to judicial transparency and accountability. Once again, the medieval solution was straightforward. Writing things down made governance easier. Over time, that simple practice helped shape the foundations of modern legal culture. Medieval city planning, or perhaps more accurately medieval city adaptation, also left permanent marks on urban landscapes. Unlike modern cities designed with grids and zoning plans, medieval towns typically evolved gradually. Streets followed old paths, property boundaries shifted through inheritance, and new buildings appeared wherever space allowed. This organic growth produced complex patterns that might seem chaotic from a modern planning perspective. Yet these irregular layouts often reflected centuries of accumulated experience. Streets curved to follow terrain or avoid flooding. Markets developed at crossroads where traffic naturally gathered. Defensive walls shaped the density of construction within them. Even when later generations attempted to modernize cities, medieval layouts often proved surprisingly resilient. Demolishing entire districts to impose new plans was expensive and politically difficult. As a result, the medieval skeleton of many European towns still influences how people move through those spaces today. Visitors walking through historic city centers often notice narrow streets and irregular plazas without realizing that these patterns reflect decisions made hundreds of years ago. Medieval urban improvisation became permanent geography. One of the most subtle medieval inheritances can be found in the culture of professional titles. Words like doctor, professor, and even master carry medieval academic origins. In universities, these titles were not merely honorifics but markers of authority within the scholarly hierarchy. A doctor originally meant someone who was authorized to teach. The Latin word doctor literally means teacher. A master was someone who had completed advanced study and could instruct students. These titles signaled responsibility as much as achievement. Over time, professional fields outside the university adopted similar language to indicate expertise and authority. Physicians became known as doctors, reflecting the historical relationship between medicine and university learning. Professors retained their academic meaning as universities expanded. Even certain craft traditions used the title master to identify individuals who had completed their training. Language has a way of preserving historical memory long after the original context has changed. When someone today addresses a medical professional as doctor, they are unknowingly participating in a medieval tradition linking knowledge with authority to teach. Perhaps the most profound lesson from all these examples is that history rarely unfolds through neat boundaries between eras. The Middle Ages did not simply end one day and give way to a completely new world. Instead, many medieval systems quietly flowed into later centuries, adapting along the way. What began as practical medieval solutions to immediate problems became frameworks that later societies found useful enough to keep. Some were refined, some were expanded, and some were transformed almost beyond recognition. But their origins remained embedded in the institutional DNA of the modern world. When historians examine the Middle Ages closely, they often discover a period far more innovative and experimental than popular imagination suggests. Medieval societies were not merely preserving ancient traditions. They were constantly building new ways to organize knowledge, trade, law, and community life. Many of those innovations were born from necessity rather than grand ambition. Town needed a market. A monastery needed a schedule. A king needed a tax. A merchant needed safe payment. A university needed rules for teaching. None of these solutions were created with the intention of shaping the next 1,000 years. Yet once a system proves useful, it gains momentum. People build routines around it. Institutions adapt to it. Generations inherit it. And gradually, what once felt temporary begins to look permanent. This quiet transformation is one of the most fascinating forces in history. The Middle Ages remind us that the structures surrounding us today, the ways we measure time, certify knowledge, organize work, record identity, and structure communities, often began as modest answers to immediate challenges. They were not meant to last forever, but history, as it often does, had other plans. And if we continue following these quiet medieval inheritances, we begin to notice that some of the most familiar structures of modern society were not created through deliberate long-term planning at all. They emerged from moments of pressure, adaptation, and experimentation. The medieval world was constantly responding to uncertainty, political fragmentation, economic revival, religious authority, and the slow rebuilding of institutions after centuries of upheaval. In that environment, solutions were judged not by how elegant they were, but by whether they worked. One particularly interesting example can be found in the medieval postal system. Communication across long distances has always been one of the great challenges of governing large territories. During the early Middle Ages, messages often traveled slowly, carried by individual messengers or travelers moving between towns. For rulers, merchants, and church officials, delays could create serious problems. Orders arrived too late. Agreements took months to confirm. News traveled unevenly. By the later Middle Ages, various kingdoms and principalities began experimenting with more organized courier networks. These systems were not designed as universal public postal services. Instead, they were created to serve specific groups, royal administrations, merchant families, or church authorities. The most famous of these networks was developed by the Thurn-Uendi-Taxis family in the Holy Roman Empire during the late medieval and early modern periods. Their courier routes connected cities across vast distances, ensuring that official correspondence could move with surprising reliability for the time. Initially, these networks existed purely to solve the administrative needs of governments and powerful trading houses. But once the infrastructure of regular routes and relay stations existed, it became clear that broader communication could also benefit from it. Over time, these courier networks gradually evolved into public postal systems. Today, when someone sends a letter or package across a country, or even across the world, they are relying on communication structures whose conceptual origins trace back to medieval courier networks designed to serve kings, bishops, and merchants. Another medieval inheritance that quietly shaped the modern world is the idea of intellectual debate as a formal educational method. In medieval universities, learning was not limited to passive listening. Students and masters participated in structured debates known as disputations. During these sessions, a question would be proposed, arguments would be presented from multiple sides, and participants would examine authorities and reasoning to defend or challenge different positions. This method reflected the intellectual environment of medieval scholasticism, which sought to reconcile faith, logic, and inherited knowledge. The goal was not simply to memorize texts, but to test ideas through disciplined argument. At the time, disputations were tools for training theologians, philosophers, and legal scholars. Yet the broader idea that knowledge advances through structured questioning and debate proved remarkably influential. Modern academic conferences, courtroom arguments, parliamentary debate, and even many classroom discussions echo the medieval disputation tradition. The format has evolved and expanded far beyond theology and philosophy, but the underlying principle remains familiar. Complex ideas become clearer when they are examined through argument and counterargument. The medieval university classroom, with its formal questioning and careful reasoning, helped establish a culture in which intellectual disagreement could be organized rather than chaotic. That culture remains central to modern scholarship. Another surprisingly durable medieval concept is the public library. While large libraries existed in the ancient world, the medieval period played an important role in preserving and transmitting written knowledge. Monasteries, cathedral schools, and later universities collected manuscripts and maintained scriptoria where texts could be copied by hand. These collections were not intended to function as modern public libraries open to everyone. Access was often restricted to clergy, scholars, or students. Yet the basic principle that knowledge should be preserved collectively and made accessible within a community of learning gradually took root. Universities maintained libraries so students could consult important works. Monasteries preserved religious and classical texts through careful copying. Over centuries, the practice of institutional book collections expanded into broader educational contexts. When printing technology arrived in the 15th century, the concept of shared libraries gained even greater importance. Eventually, public libraries emerged as civic institutions dedicated to education and cultural preservation. Although the scale and accessibility of modern libraries far exceed their medieval predecessors, the tradition of institutional knowledge preservation owes much to the quiet work of medieval scribes and scholars who believed that texts should survive beyond the lifetime of any single reader. Medieval festivals also left a surprisingly strong cultural legacy. Throughout the Middle Ages, communities celebrated numerous seasonal festivals tied to agricultural cycles, religious observances, and local traditions. Harvest festivals, winter celebrations, and spring gatherings provided opportunities for markets, performances, and communal feasting. These events served many purposes at once. They reinforced social bonds, allowed trade and entertainment to flourish, and provided relief from the demanding routines of agricultural life. Over time, some of these medieval festivals evolved into modern cultural celebrations. While their meanings have often changed, the structure of communal seasonal gatherings persists. Many European and North American holiday traditions, from winter festivals to harvest celebrations, still echo patterns established centuries ago. Even the modern idea of the town square as a central gathering place reflects medieval urban design. Markets, public announcements, celebrations, and political gatherings often occurred in open spaces near churches or administrative buildings. These squares were practical spaces where people naturally congregated, yet they also became symbolic centers of community life. When later cities developed parks, plazas, and civic squares, they were continuing a tradition deeply rooted in medieval town organization. One final example of medieval permanence can be seen in the concept of academic tenure. In medieval universities, scholars often received certain protections from political interference once they were recognized as masters within their institutions. These privileges were designed to ensure that teachers could pursue scholarship without constant fear of external pressure from local authorities. The system was not identical to modern academic tenure, but it established an important principle. Intellectual inquiry benefits from a degree of institutional independence. Centuries later, universities formalized tenure systems to protect academic freedom and encourage long-term research. Once again, a medieval attempt to shield scholars from instability contributed to a lasting institutional norm. Looking across all these examples, universities, surnames, banking systems, apprenticeships, postal routes, legal records, academic debate, libraries, festivals, and professional protections, we begin to see the Middle Ages in a different light. Rather than a static period between ancient and modern worlds, it becomes clear that the medieval era functioned as a laboratory of social organization. Communities experimented constantly with ways to manage trade, learning, governance, identity, and communication. Many of those experiments faded with time, but some proved unexpectedly resilient. They survived because they addressed real human needs. The need to share knowledge, to coordinate communities, to regulate commerce, to communicate across distance, and to organize authority. When a solution met those needs effectively, people continued using it. Over generations, repetition turned temporary arrangements into tradition. And eventually, tradition became something that later societies accepted as part of the natural order. So when we look around at the structures that organize modern life, from the degrees hanging on university walls to the surnames printed on passports, from the rhythms of the calendar to the routes connecting cities, we are often looking at the distant consequences of medieval choices. Choices that were never meant to last forever. But history has a remarkable way of preserving the things that work. And when historians look carefully at the Middle Ages, they often notice something subtle but important. Many systems that survived were not necessarily the most sophisticated or the most ambitious. They were simply the ones that fit naturally into everyday life. A structure that people must constantly fight against rarely survives for long. But a structure that quietly supports daily routines tends to become invisible, and invisible systems can last for centuries. One medieval inheritance that illustrates this perfectly is the notary system. In many parts of medieval Europe, especially in regions influenced by Roman legal traditions such as Italy and southern France, the notary became an essential figure in everyday legal life. Notaries were trained officials authorized to write and certify documents. They recorded contracts, wills, property transfers, marriage agreements, and countless other arrangements that required formal recognition. At first, this was simply a practical response to the growing complexity of medieval commerce and property ownership. As towns expanded and trade networks widened, agreements between individuals needed reliable documentation. Verbal promises were no longer enough when merchants were dealing with distant partners or when property rights had to survive generations. The notary offered a solution because notaries were trained and authorized to produce legally recognized documents. Their records carried authority beyond the immediate parties involved. Copies of agreements could be stored, verified, and referenced if disputes arose later. This system proved extremely efficient. Rather than requiring courts to oversee every agreement directly, notaries allowed legal transactions to occur smoothly within daily life. The result was a culture of written contracts that strengthened commercial trust. Centuries later, the notary system still exists in many legal systems around the world. Modern notaries public, though sometimes less central than their medieval counterparts, continue to authenticate documents and certify legal acts. Once again, a medieval administrative solution designed for convenience quietly became part of the long-term structure of law. Another medieval idea that proved remarkably resilient is the concept of professional licensing. In medieval cities, guilds controlled entry into skilled trades. A craftsman could not simply declare themselves a master mason or goldsmith without demonstrating competence and receiving approval from the guild. This system protected both the reputation of the craft and the economic stability of those practicing it. Customers benefited from knowing that goods produced by guild members met certain standards. Authorities benefited because guilds helped regulate economic activity within cities. Apprentices benefited from structured training and a clear path toward professional recognition. The guild system itself eventually weakened as industrial economies developed, but the principle it embodied did not disappear. Today, many professions still require formal certification before individuals are allowed to practice. Doctors must pass licensing examinations. Lawyers must be admitted to the bar. Engineers, architects, pilots, and countless other professionals operate under systems that verify competence. These modern licensing systems differ in many ways from medieval guilds, yet they reflect the same basic idea. Society benefits when complex or risky work is performed by individuals whose skills have been formally recognized. Medieval universities and guilds together helped establish the long-lasting principle that expertise should be demonstrated and verified before authority is granted. Medieval taxation systems also produced habits that continue shaping public administration. In many kingdoms, rulers needed to estimate wealth or production within their territories in order to collect taxes effectively. This often required surveys of land, population, or resources. One famous early example is the Domesday Book commissioned by William the Conqueror in England in 1086. The survey recorded land holdings, livestock, agricultural resources, and the obligations attached to them. Its purpose was straightforward: to understand the economic capacity of the kingdom for taxation and governance. The idea of systematically documenting economic resources proved extremely valuable. Later administrations in many countries adopted similar practices, refining them into censuses, land registries, and tax records. Today, national censuses and economic surveys remain essential tools for modern governments. They guide policy decisions, infrastructure planning, and public services. Although the methods have become far more sophisticated, the underlying logic, that effective governance requires detailed information about land and population, was already clear to medieval administrators. Another medieval inheritance that continues to influence the modern world is the tradition of ceremonial state rituals. And perhaps the most fascinating aspect of all these medieval inheritances is how ordinary they must have seemed at the time. None of the people living through the 12th, 13th, or 14th centuries believed they were laying down the long-term architecture of modern life. They were farmers, merchants, clerks, priests, rulers, and craftsmen simply trying to manage the realities of their own era. Yet the structures they built, sometimes out of urgency, sometimes out of habit, proved surprisingly resilient. One example that often goes unnoticed is the medieval system of property documentation. Land was the central form of wealth throughout much of the Middle Ages. Control of farmland determined food production, taxation, and political power. As a result, questions about who owned what land were extremely important. Disputes could easily arise when borders shifted, when families inherited property, or when land was granted to monasteries, nobles, or towns. To reduce these conflicts, medieval authorities increasingly relied on written charters. These documents described land boundaries, ownership rights, and the obligations tied to a property. Charters were witnessed, copied, and stored carefully, often in monasteries or administrative archives. At the time, these records were created simply to avoid confusion. But the practice of documenting property rights in durable written form had enormous long-term consequences. Over centuries, property law developed around the expectation that ownership should be clearly recorded and legally verifiable. Modern land registries, title deeds, and property records all reflect this medieval habit of documenting land ownership. Even digital property databases used by modern governments operate on the same basic principle that medieval scribes understood well. Land rights become far more stable when they are written down and preserved. Another medieval institution that quietly shaped modern society is the hospital. In the early Middle Ages, hospitals were not medical centers in the modern sense. Many of them functioned more like charitable shelters, offering care to the poor, travelers, or the sick who had nowhere else to go. They were often operated by religious communities, particularly monasteries or church foundations. The purpose of these institutions was rooted in Christian charity. Caring for the vulnerable was considered a moral duty, and providing shelter and assistance to the sick or injured formed part of that obligation. Over time, however, hospitals became more specialized. Some focused on particular illnesses. Others provided organized care for pilgrims or the elderly. Medical knowledge during the medieval period was limited by modern standards, but the institutional framework for organized care had been established. When medical science advanced dramatically in later centuries, hospitals were already recognized as places where the sick could gather for treatment. The medieval tradition of organized charitable care provided a foundation on which modern healthcare institutions could grow. Another medieval practice that remains deeply embedded in modern governance is the use of seals and signatures to authenticate official documents. During the Middle Ages, literacy was far from universal, and many people could not read the documents that governed their legal or political obligations. To ensure authenticity, rulers, nobles, and institutions often used wax seals impressed with distinctive designs. A seal served as a guarantee that a document truly originated from the authority it claimed. The unique symbol or image pressed into the wax acted as a recognizable mark of legitimacy. Over time, personal signatures gradually replaced seals in many contexts as literacy increased. Yet the principle behind the practice remains exactly the same. Important documents require visible proof that they were authorized by the correct individual or institution. Modern legal systems still rely on signatures, notarization, and official certification to verify authenticity. Digital systems even replicate the concept through electronic signatures and cryptographic verification. In a sense, modern digital authentication systems are distant technological descendants of medieval wax seals. Medieval navigation and mapping also contributed to long-lasting habits of geographical thinking. Although medieval maps often appear symbolic or stylized to modern eyes, they still played important roles in organizing geographic knowledge. Portolan charts used by Mediterranean sailors during the later Middle Ages were especially sophisticated for their time. These charts showed coastlines, ports, and compass directions with surprising accuracy. They were not created for academic curiosity. They were practical tools for navigation and trade. Sailors relied on them to move safely between ports and to estimate distances along familiar routes. Over time, these mapping traditions helped shape the broader European understanding of geography. As exploration expanded during the 15th and 16th centuries, cartographers built upon earlier techniques developed by medieval navigators. Modern geographic mapping systems are vastly more advanced, but they still reflect the same basic human need: to represent space visually so that travel and communication become more predictable. Even the concept of the academic lecture has medieval origins. In medieval universities, books were rare and extremely valuable. Students could not simply purchase personal copies of important texts. As a result, much learning occurred through lectures in which a master read from an authoritative text and explained its meaning to students. The word lecture itself comes from the Latin word lectura, meaning a reading. The teacher would literally read aloud from a manuscript while interpreting its content. Although modern education has transformed dramatically through printed books, digital resources, and interactive teaching methods, the lecture format remains a recognizable feature of academic life. A teacher presenting knowledge to a group of students in a structured setting still reflects the medieval classroom environment. Another medieval tradition that has quietly endured is the organization of professional associations. Guilds originally served as economic regulators within cities, but they also provided social and professional networks for their members. Craftsmen gathered for meetings, religious observances, and community decision-making. Membership created a sense of identity and shared responsibility. Modern professional associations perform similar functions in many industries today. They organize conferences, publish research, establish ethical guidelines, and represent the interests of professionals within particular fields. While the economic power of medieval guilds was often greater than that of modern associations, the idea that professionals benefit from collective organization remains firmly rooted in medieval practice. Perhaps the most subtle medieval legacy of all lies in the simple expectation that institutions should endure beyond the lifetime of individuals. In earlier eras, political and economic life often revolved around personal relationships. Authority could vanish quickly when a leader died or alliances shifted. Medieval institutions gradually introduced structures designed to outlast individual personalities. Universities, monasteries, guilds, courts, and administrative offices all operated on the principle that the institution itself should remain stable even as people came and went. This concept of institutional continuity is now so familiar that it often goes unnoticed. Governments change leaders, companies change executives, universities change professors, yet the institutions themselves continue functioning. That expectation of stability owes much to medieval experiments in building organizations that could survive generations. And when we look at the modern world through this lens, the Middle Ages begin to appear less distant than we might imagine. The streets of medieval towns shaped modern cities. The charters of medieval markets shaped urban economies. The records of medieval courts shaped legal systems. The habits of medieval universities shaped modern education. Even the rhythms of time, the patterns of holidays, the structure of professional training, and the organization of knowledge carry echoes of medieval solutions. Most of these things were never meant to last forever. They were simply answers to problems faced by people living hundreds of years ago. But history has a curious way of preserving useful ideas. Once a system proves itself reliable, societies often keep using it, sometimes long after the original problem has disappeared. And so the medieval world, which often feels distant and temporary, quietly remains with us, not as a museum piece or a forgotten chapter of history, but as part of the invisible framework through which modern life still operates. And when we look closely at these quiet inheritances from the medieval world, something else becomes clear. Permanence in history is rarely the result of a single decision. It is usually the result of repetition. A practice that continues long enough becomes familiar. Familiarity becomes expectation. And expectation eventually becomes something people struggle to imagine living without. One medieval system that illustrates this process remarkably well is the structure of municipal government. As European towns expanded during the High Middle Ages, they faced a problem that earlier rural communities rarely encountered: how to manage a large population living in close proximity. Towns required rules about markets, sanitation, trade, construction and public order. Yet kings and distant lords could not manage these details from afar. The solution in many regions was the development of town councils. These councils were often made up of prominent merchants, property holders, and guild representatives who oversaw local regulations. Their responsibilities might include maintaining roads, regulating market prices, resolving commercial disputes, and managing defensive walls or city gates. At the time, these councils were not conceived as democratic institutions in the modern sense. Participation was limited, and political power often remained concentrated among wealthy families. But the principle behind the system proved extremely powerful. Local communities could manage many of their own affairs more efficiently than distant authorities. Over centuries, this concept of local governance evolved and expanded. Town councils became municipal governments. Representation widened. Elections gradually replaced hereditary influence in many places. Today, city councils, mayors, and municipal administrations form the backbone of local governance across much of the world. Yet their roots lie in medieval towns where merchants and guild leaders gathered to regulate markets and maintain order within their walls. Another medieval creation that continues to shape everyday life is the system of street addresses. In early medieval settlements, addresses were rarely necessary. People lived in small communities where directions were given through landmarks or personal familiarity. A visitor might be told to find the baker near the church or the house beside the mill. But as towns grew larger and more complex, these informal descriptions became less practical. Administrators needed ways to identify properties for taxation, legal disputes, and record-keeping. Gradually, buildings began to be associated with identifiable markers, signs, numbers, or consistent descriptions tied to specific streets. The process of formalizing addresses took many centuries, but the foundation emerged during the late medieval and early modern periods as cities struggled to organize growing populations. Today, street names and numbered addresses form an essential part of modern infrastructure. Postal delivery, emergency services, navigation systems, and countless administrative processes depend on precise location identification. Yet this seemingly obvious system emerged slowly from medieval efforts to manage increasingly crowded urban environments. Another enduring medieval idea is the concept of regulated marketplaces. Markets had existed long before the Middle Ages, but medieval authorities placed particular emphasis on organizing and protecting them. A market charter granted a town the right to hold regular trading days under official protection. Rules governed where goods could be sold, how weights and measures were used, and how disputes were resolved. These regulations were not merely bureaucratic exercises. Markets formed the economic heart of many towns, and maintaining trust within them was essential. Merchants needed assurance that contracts would be honored and that cheating could be punished. Over time, the medieval market square became both a commercial and social center. Trade, announcements, festivals, and civic gatherings all took place there. Modern economic regulation, from consumer protection laws to business licensing, continues to reflect the medieval insight that commerce functions best when clear rules protect both buyers and sellers. Even the concept of the academic curriculum has medieval origins. Medieval universities structured education around the trivium and the quadrivium. The trivium included grammar, rhetoric, and logic skills considered essential for understanding language and argument. The quadrivium included arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, disciplines associated with mathematical understanding of the world. This system was not intended to represent all knowledge. It was simply a practical framework for organizing foundational education. Yet the idea that education should follow a structured curriculum proved extremely influential. Later educational systems expanded and modified these categories, but the basic concept remained. Students progress through defined stages of learning designed to build intellectual competence. Modern school systems, with their sequences of subjects and levels, still reflect the medieval habit of organizing education into structured pathways. Another medieval development that continues shaping the modern world is the culture of written contracts. While agreements had long existed in many societies, the increasing use of written contracts during the Middle Ages transformed economic relationships. Merchants, landowners, and institutions increasingly relied on documents to define obligations, prices, deadlines, and responsibilities. The growing complexity of medieval trade networks made such documentation essential. Contracts allowed individuals to cooperate even when they lived far apart or did not know one another personally. This reliance on written agreements laid the groundwork for modern contract law. Today, nearly every aspect of economic life, employment, housing, finance, commerce, operates through formal agreements recorded in writing. The medieval merchant drafting a trade agreement in a crowded marketplace might not have realized it, but he was participating in the gradual expansion of a legal culture that still governs modern economic relationships. Medieval food regulation offers another fascinating example of temporary solutions becoming permanent expectations. In many medieval cities, authorities regulated the quality and price of essential foods such as bread, wine, and ale. These regulations were not abstract economic theories. They were practical responses to the risk of shortages, fraud, or public unrest. Bread in particular received careful attention. Bakers were often required to produce loaves of specific weights tied to the price of grain. If grain became more expensive, the size of the loaf changed accordingly. These rules protected consumers from unfair practices while helping maintain stability during periods of fluctuating food supply. Modern food safety standards and consumer protection laws follow a similar philosophy. Governments inspect food production, regulate labeling, and enforce standards designed to protect public health. Although the technologies involved are vastly more advanced, the underlying principle that authorities have a role in ensuring fairness and safety in essential goods echoes medieval market regulation. Another subtle medieval legacy lies in the development of archives as instruments of governance. As medieval administrations grew more sophisticated, rulers and institutions discovered that maintaining organized records improved efficiency. Documents related to taxes, legal disputes, land ownership, and political agreements needed to be stored systematically. Over time, archives became central to administration. They allowed governments to track obligations, confirm rights, and reference earlier decisions when resolving disputes. Modern bureaucratic states rely even more heavily on record-keeping, though now through digital systems rather than parchment manuscripts. Yet the medieval archive established the fundamental idea that governing complex societies requires preserving information across generations. Perhaps the most important lesson from all these examples is that historical change is often quieter than we expect. When we imagine history, we tend to focus on dramatic events. Wars, revolutions, discoveries, and famous leaders. These moments certainly shape the course of societies. But beneath those visible events lies a slower process, the gradual development of institutions, habits, and systems that structure daily life. The Middle Ages were full of such developments. Towns organized markets, universities structured learning, courts recorded decisions, merchants drafted contracts, councils governed cities. Each of these systems solved a specific problem faced by medieval communities. But once they proved effective, they did not simply disappear when the medieval period ended. They continued, and through centuries of repetition and adaptation, they became part of the invisible framework that still supports modern society. In many ways, the Middle Ages left behind more than castles and manuscripts. They left behind habits of organization, and habits, once established, can last longer than empires. And when we follow these quiet medieval inheritances a little further, another truth becomes visible. The Middle Ages did not only produce institutions that survived. It also produced habits of thinking, ways of organizing society that later generations accepted almost without noticing their origins. Some of these habits are so deeply embedded in modern life that it is difficult to imagine a world without them. One of the clearest examples is the medieval development of the public clock tower as a civic symbol. When mechanical clocks first appeared in European towns during the late 13th and 14th centuries, they were technological curiosities as much as practical tools. Building one required skilled metalwork, complex gearing, and significant expense. Town authorities often installed them in prominent towers overlooking the marketplace or city square. But the clock tower was not only about telling time. It also communicated something about civic organization. A town with a functioning public clock demonstrated coordination, engineering skill, and economic stability. The regular ringing of bells signaled the beginning of market hours, council meetings, religious services, and curfews. Gradually, the clock tower became a visual statement of urban identity. Travelers arriving from the countryside could see it rising above rooftops, marking the town as a center of commerce and administration. Even today, many historic cities still center their public life around clock towers built centuries ago. And although modern digital timekeeping has replaced mechanical gears in most practical contexts, the symbolic power of the clock tower remains. It represents shared time, the idea that a community organizes itself around common rhythms. Another medieval system that continues shaping modern life is the legal concept of precedent. As courts during the Middle Ages began recording decisions more carefully, judges and legal scholars discovered that earlier rulings could guide later cases. When a similar dispute arose, they could look back at previous judgments to determine how comparable issues had been resolved. This practice was not originally intended to create an elaborate legal doctrine. It simply helped ensure consistency. If two nearly identical disputes were judged in completely different ways, the legitimacy of the courts could be questioned. Over time, however, reliance on earlier rulings developed into a structured legal principle. Precedent became a way of stabilizing law, allowing legal systems to evolve gradually while maintaining continuity. Modern common law systems still rely heavily on precedent. Courts regularly examine earlier cases when making decisions, and legal arguments often depend on interpreting past rulings. What began as a practical medieval method for maintaining consistency in court decisions became one of the defining features of entire legal traditions. Another medieval legacy that quietly endures is the tradition of academic gowns and ceremonial dress. In medieval universities, scholars typically wore long robes similar to the clothing worn by clergy. These garments were practical as well as symbolic. Universities were often connected to religious institutions, and the clothing reflected the scholarly and clerical identity of those engaged in learning. Over time, academic robes became markers of status within the university hierarchy. Different styles indicated different ranks: bachelors, masters, and doctors. Ceremonial occasions such as graduations or official gatherings reinforced these visual distinctions. Although modern academic life looks very different from medieval university culture, the tradition of academic dress continues. Graduation ceremonies around the world still feature gowns, hoods, and caps that trace their lineage to medieval scholastic clothing. These garments serve as visual reminders that modern education has deep historical roots. Medieval agriculture also produced lasting influences through the organization of farmland. One particularly important system was the open field system used in many parts of medieval Europe. Instead of dividing farmland into privately enclosed plots, villages often cultivated large open fields divided into strips. Individual families farmed specific strips, but the fields themselves were managed collectively according to shared planting and harvesting schedules. This arrangement allowed communities to coordinate labor and share resources such as plows and animals. It also helped distribute risk by ensuring that each household had strips in different parts of the field, reducing the impact of localized crop failure. Although later agricultural reforms eventually replaced the open field system in many regions, the experience of managing land collectively influenced rural traditions for centuries. Even modern discussions about land use, cooperative farming, and agricultural policy reflect questions that medieval villagers once faced while working their shared fields. Another medieval practice that continues to shape daily life is the numbering of years according to the Anno Domini system. While various calendars existed throughout history, the system of counting years from the estimated birth of Christ gradually spread across Europe during the medieval period. Church scholars and administrators found it useful for organizing historical records, legal documents, and religious observances. By the later Middle Ages, this dating system had become widely used in official documents across much of Europe. Today, the same basic numbering system remains standard in many parts of the world, even in largely secular societies. Though often labeled more neutrally as CE, Common Era, the structure of counting years follows the same medieval framework. Few people think about this when writing a date on a document or scheduling a meeting. Yet the calendar structure guiding modern timekeeping reflects choices made by medieval scholars seeking a consistent way to organize historical chronology. Another fascinating medieval inheritance is the tradition of public universities supported by governments or civic institutions. While the earliest universities often operated as independent scholarly communities, many gradually formed close relationships with local rulers or city authorities. These partnerships provided financial support, legal protection, and sometimes dedicated buildings. In return, universities educated administrators, lawyers, and clergy who served the broader needs of society. Over centuries, this relationship between higher education and public authority expanded dramatically. Today, many of the world's largest universities operate with public funding and serve millions of students. The medieval partnership between learning communities and governing authorities laid the groundwork for this modern system. Perhaps one of the most subtle medieval contributions to modern life is the expectation that expertise matters. During the medieval period, scholars, craftsmen, and professionals began organizing knowledge in increasingly systematic ways. Guilds established standards for craftsmanship. Universities created pathways for intellectual training. Courts developed procedures requiring trained legal specialists. These developments reinforced a powerful idea. Certain tasks require specialized knowledge that must be learned through training and experience. Modern society depends heavily on this principle. Doctors, engineers, scientists, teachers, and countless other professionals operate within systems that recognize and certify expertise. The medieval world did not invent expertise, of course, but it played a crucial role in institutionalizing the structures that allow expertise to be taught, evaluated, and trusted. Looking across all these examples, municipal councils, street addresses, legal precedent, academic robes, agricultural systems, calendars, universities, and professional expertise, the pattern becomes unmistakable. The Middle Ages were not simply a transitional period between ancient and modern times. They were a period of quiet construction. People living during those centuries were constantly building systems to solve immediate problems. Most of these solutions were modest. They were practical responses to the needs of towns, markets, schools, and communities. Yet because they worked, they endured. And through centuries of repetition, adaptation, and inheritance, they became part of the underlying framework of modern society. When we look at the world around us today, the way cities are governed, the way knowledge is organized, the way contracts are written, the way education is structured, we are often seeing the distant consequences of medieval experimentation. Experiments that were never meant to be permanent. But once a useful system enters daily life, it tends to stay there. And so the medieval world, far from disappearing into the past, continues quietly shaping the present. One habit, one institution, and one inherited idea at a time. And when historians trace these patterns even further, another realization begins to emerge. Many of the medieval things that never went away survived not because they were perfect, but because they became deeply woven into ordinary routines. Once a system becomes part of daily life, something people rely on without thinking, replacing it becomes difficult. Even when societies change dramatically, familiar structures often remain quietly in place beneath the surface. One clear example of this can be seen in the medieval origins of the modern passport. In the medieval world, travel across long distances was rarely casual. Roads could be dangerous, borders uncertain, and authorities often suspicious of strangers moving through their territories. Pilgrims, merchants, scholars, and messengers all needed ways to demonstrate that their travel had legitimate purpose. One solution was the use of letters of safe conduct. These documents, issued by rulers, bishops, or other authorities, granted the bearer permission to pass through certain territories without interference. They might confirm the traveler's identity, explain their mission, or request that local officials offer protection. These letters were often temporary, written for a specific journey or diplomatic purpose. But the underlying idea proved useful. Travelers could carry official documents verifying who they were and why they were traveling. Over centuries, this practice evolved gradually into the modern passport system. Today, passports serve many more functions, including international identification and border control. Yet the core principle, that a traveler carries official documentation issued by an authority, reflects a medieval solution to the challenges of movement in a politically fragmented world. Another medieval practice that quietly shaped modern society is the concept of standardized education levels. During the medieval period, universities developed clear stages through which students progressed. A young scholar might first complete basic studies before advancing to higher levels of learning under the supervision of masters. The process was structured and sequential, creating a recognizable path toward intellectual authority. This idea that education should follow defined stages proved extremely influential. Later school systems expanded the concept, introducing primary education, secondary education, and higher education as separate but connected levels. Modern educational pathways, from elementary school to doctoral study, still reflect this layered structure of progressive learning. Although the subjects and teaching methods have changed dramatically, the expectation that education unfolds through organized stages traces back to medieval academic culture. Another medieval development that remains deeply embedded in modern life is the culture of civic record keeping. As towns grew larger during the High Middle Ages, administrators needed ways to track decisions, property transactions, legal rulings, and financial obligations. City governments began maintaining written records of council meetings, tax collections, and regulatory decisions. These municipal archives served practical purposes. They allowed officials to reference earlier agreements, verify obligations, and resolve disputes using documented evidence. Over time, this habit of recording public decisions became central to responsible governance. Modern city administrations still produce detailed records of meetings, budgets, and legislation. Transparency and accountability depend heavily on written documentation, a principle medieval administrators had already discovered. Even the idea of zoning or regulating urban space has medieval roots. Medieval towns often separated certain types of activity for practical reasons. Tanneries, for example, were frequently located near rivers outside dense residential areas because their work produced strong odors and required access to water. Markets were concentrated in central squares where goods could be inspected and taxed easily. Certain trades clustered together for convenience and oversight. These arrangements were not formal zoning laws in the modern sense, but they reflected an early understanding that urban spaces function more smoothly when activities are organized thoughtfully. Modern city planning expanded this principle into detailed zoning regulations that designate areas for residential, commercial, industrial, or recreational use. Yet the basic insight that cities benefit from organizing different activities in appropriate locations was already evident in medieval urban practice. Another enduring medieval inheritance can be found in the structure of academic research itself. In medieval universities, scholars were expected not only to learn existing knowledge but also to interpret, analyze, and debate it. Intellectual work involved careful reading of authoritative texts followed by commentary and discussion. This method created a culture in which scholarship built upon previous scholarship. Scholars cited earlier authorities, responded to arguments, and contributed new interpretations. Modern academic research continues to follow a similar pattern. Researchers review previous studies, develop new analyses, and publish their findings so others can evaluate and build upon them. Although the tools of research have changed dramatically, from handwritten manuscripts to digital databases, the collaborative structure of scholarship remains strikingly similar to the intellectual culture cultivated in medieval universities. Another medieval development that still shapes daily life is the tradition of civic bells. Church bells and town bells were essential communication tools during the Middle Ages. They signaled religious services, warned of danger, announced public meetings, and marked important moments such as the opening or closing of city gates. In an era before widespread literacy or electronic communication, Bells served as audible signals that reached the entire community at once. While modern societies rely on different technologies for communication, the idea of shared auditory signals remains familiar. School bells marking class periods, alarm sirens warning of emergencies, and even certain public announcement systems reflect the same basic principle. Sound can organize communal action quickly and effectively. Another medieval tradition that survived in subtle ways is the practice of documenting genealogy. Medieval nobles often recorded family lineage carefully to establish claims to property, titles, and political authority. Genealogical records helped clarify inheritance rights and reinforce the legitimacy of ruling families. Although modern societies rarely rely on genealogy for political power, the practice of tracing family history remains culturally significant. Many people today explore ancestry through historical records, archives, and genealogical research. The medieval habit of recording lineage helped preserve historical continuity across generations. In many cases, modern genealogists still rely on documents originally created for medieval legal or aristocratic purposes. Perhaps one of the most enduring medieval contributions is the simple expectation that institutions should accumulate knowledge over time. Medieval monasteries, universities, and administrative offices all maintained collections of documents, books, and records that grew gradually across generations. Each generation preserved the work of the previous one while adding its own contributions. This cumulative approach to knowledge became one of the defining features of modern civilization. Scientific research, legal systems, historical scholarship, and technological development all depend on the ability to preserve and build upon earlier work. Without the medieval commitment to maintaining archives, libraries, and institutional memory, much of this continuity would have been impossible. When we step back and look at the larger picture, the Middle Ages appear very different from the simple image of castles and knights that often dominates popular imagination. They were also a time when societies were learning how to organize themselves on a larger scale, how to manage cities, regulate trade, preserve knowledge, educate specialists, and maintain institutions across generations. Many of the solutions developed during that period were never intended to last beyond immediate circumstances. They were temporary responses to medieval challenges. But once those solutions proved useful, people continued using them. And the longer they were used, the more permanent they became. That is one of the quiet truths of history. The things that last are not always the things designed to last. They are simply the things that people find difficult to live without. And in the end, that may be the most interesting lesson the Middle Ages leave behind. When people imagine medieval history, they often picture a world that disappeared. Castles crumbling into ruins, kings replaced by modern governments, knights fading into legend. Can feel like an era sealed off from the present, a long chapter that closed centuries ago. But when we look more carefully, the story is much quieter than that. Because so many parts of the medieval world never actually went away. The universities where millions of students study today grew from medieval communities of scholars seeking protection and recognition. The surnames we sign on documents began as simple descriptions used to distinguish neighbors in growing towns. The legal traditions of precedent, contracts, and recorded judgments evolved from medieval courts trying to maintain fairness and consistency. Even the rhythms of the calendar, the structure of education, the idea of professional expertise, and the expectation that institutions should outlast individuals all carry traces of medieval thinking. None of these things were designed as monuments meant to endure for 1,000 years. They were solutions to everyday problems faced by medieval people: how to organize learning, how to protect trade, how to govern towns, how to identify individuals, how to keep records, how to manage time, and how to maintain order in communities that were slowly becoming larger and more complex. And because those solutions worked, people kept using them. Generation after generation, the systems remained. They were adjusted, expanded, and modernized, but rarely were they completely replaced. History often celebrates dramatic moments, revolutions, discoveries, wars that redraw maps. Yet the quieter forces of continuity are just as powerful. Institutions, habits, and systems built centuries ago can persist long after the world that created them has changed. The medieval world, in that sense, never truly vanished. It simply blended into the structures of the present. So the next time you walk through a city square, attend a university, sign your name to a contract, or glance at a clock tower marking the passing hours, you may be encountering something that began not in the modern world, but in the Middle Ages. Things that were supposed to be temporary, but never quite went away.